Who actually landed the plane? Episode 1, The Lavatory Passenger. I've only ever flown once in my life. One of my relatives likes to say whenever the conversation turns to travel. A fully grown woman, bank manager no less. And that was in the lavatory, from takeoff to landing. It sounds ridiculous, almost impossible, and yet it's true. A genuinely funny story, actually. But let's not rush ahead. The final years of the Soviet Union. I had just transferred to Kiev's Boryspil Airport after finishing my mandatory assignment in Yakutsk, where I'd been flying the Tupolev Tu-154, a fairly large airplane, around 180 passengers, a medium-range workhorse. It carried half the country. Old Soviet-built machine? Yes. But inside the cabin, it honestly didn't feel very different from a modern Boeing 737. The real differences were in the cockpit. 4 crew seats, 2 pilots, flight navigator, flight engineer, more switches than common sense, same cruising speed, same altitude. It burned an impressive amount of fuel, but that's another story. Still, it was highly automated and surprisingly comfortable to fly. I could praise that airplane for quite a while, but at that moment, I was on vacation. My wife, our 10-year-old daughter, and I decided to spend some time in Crimea. Once the relatives heard about it, they enthusiastically added a few of their own children to the plan, all between 10 and 12 years old. Just like that, we became a group of 7. Somehow we managed to get vacation vouchers for everyone. We bought tickets there and back and flew to Simferopol. Everything completely normal. Everyone in their assigned seats. No signs yet of what was coming. At Simferopol Airport, we found a LAZ bus with a sign for our boarding house. What today would probably be called a transfer. And off we went. Hot, crowded, no air conditioning. Perfectly normal back then. Nobody complained. We simply didn't know there was any other way. Episode 2. Everything was accounted for. We couldn't see the sea as we entered the boarding house, but the smell made it obvious. It was close. I'm not a fan of the Soviet era, not even slightly. These days, though, I often hear people talk about it in ways that don't quite match reality. Places like this might explain why some still remember it fondly. This wasn't an elite resort, not the southern coast with its old imperial palaces. Just a simple boarding house, the kind ordinary workers could afford through trade union vouchers. Very cheap. There were, of course, other places. Higher levels of comfort. You just weren't meant to see them. Even the smallest hint of luxury preferred to stay out of sight. Here, everything was sufficient. The territory was large, surprisingly well maintained. There were exotic plants, carefully looked after. In the evenings, the smell of pine hung in the air, thick, almost intoxicating. Tennis courts, volleyball and football fields, dance floors, an open-air green theater where well-known performers would come, even a hairdresser. At a set time, the loudspeaker would come alive. Boarding house guests are invited for lunch. Inside, a large pot of borscht stood on the table with a ladle. Take as much as you like. Meat, side dishes. The food was varied and good, not refined, but satisfying. Dried fruit compote, always there. A fixed table for 4. No choices to make, none needed. There was also the activities organizer. He worked with real enthusiasm. Competitions felt genuine. People got involved easily. Some played. Others watched. No one seemed completely outside it. Leisure was organized well, cheerful, useful, as they used to say. From the outside, it looked almost like a small, self-contained paradise. And in a way, it was, with one condition. If you didn't make serious political mistakes, if you didn't complain, if you didn't step out of line, life was comfortable. You followed the rules. You didn't ask unnecessary questions. That was enough. There was comfort, but no luxury. Luxury belonged to the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie was the enemy, so there were no showers in the rooms. You washed at scheduled times, in a designated place. Everything was arranged, everything was accounted for, and at the same time, there were just enough small comforts to make you feel taken care of, without ever letting you forget the limits. The quiet hour made that especially clear. After lunch, you might feel like lying down for a while, and then suddenly, everything stopped. The corridors fell silent. "Better not," the attendant would say calmly. "Everyone is resting." "Couldn't you have gone earlier?" she might add, with a trace of irritation. "All right, go on. Just quietly, and next time, follow the schedule." No one raised their voice. No one forced anything, but the rules were there, and everyone understood them. People didn't smile much back then, at least not in the way you might expect. No, keep smiling. That would have felt artificial, even suspicious. And yet, behind that reserved tone, there was often a kind of quiet goodwill. People were different, of course. They always are. I remember one episode from my studies. From the very first year, in every institution, there was one subject everyone had to take: the history of the Communist Party. The professor was an older man, gray-haired. "Take a ticket," he said. I had tried to prepare, of course, but none of it made any sense to me. He must have noticed. He took my grade book and looked through it. Higher mathematics. Excellent. Physics. Excellent. He nodded. "Well," he said, "our subject is not quite as complicated as physics." And he gave me the highest mark, but one exam question stayed with me. I remember it word for word. "Why is the teaching of Marx and Lenin all-powerful?" There was only one correct answer. "Because it is true." That was enough. No proof required. Our 2 weeks passed quickly. We swam in the sea, got sunburned, and enjoyed ourselves more than we probably expected. For a while, it felt like nothing else existed outside that place. But everything comes to an end. It was time to pack and go home, and that's when the surprise was waiting for us. Episode 3, Hours. How it happened, I still don't quite understand. Of course, I was used to stressful situations, but when I realized that our bus to the airport was scheduled for tomorrow, while our flight ticket was only for the day after, it's hard to describe the state I was in. Not leaving wasn't an option. Our stay was over, and extending it was simply impossible. That option didn't exist, not for any amount of money. And honestly, what money were we even talking about? In the Soviet Union, any unofficial money could land you behind bars immediately. Though come to think of it, we didn't have any money anyway. Just a few small bills left. And there were 7 of us. We still had to eat somehow. The free ride was over. In short, it was not a cheerful departure. Well then, we had arrived, in every sense of the word, at the airport and generally. What next? We settled on a bench near the terminal. I still had my airfield pass with me. The standard all-union one, with a red diagonal stripe, which meant I had access to the airside of any airport in the USSR. So I went. Not because I expected anything. There was no flight to Kiev in the schedule that day. And even if there had been, we didn't have the money for new tickets anyway. I just didn't feel like sitting around doing nothing. Then, already out on the apron, I looked up and couldn't believe my eyes. A Tu-154 was taxiing into a nearby stand. Ours, from Boryspil. I knew them all by their tail numbers. My heart started beating faster. I walked closer, waited for the crew to come out. "Where are you headed?" came the question immediately. "Home, to Boryspil." "Why aren't you on the schedule?" "We're delayed, diverted due to a thunderstorm." I knew the captain well. I explained the situation, and despite the fact that there were no available seats, he agreed to help immediately. "The aircraft is big. We'll take you." He asked the first officer to coordinate with passenger services. After all, we did have tickets, even if they were for the next day. And the flight itself was only about an hour. I ran back to my group, almost excited. Get up. We're flying. Right now. Let's go to check-in. Episode 4. The best seat on the aircraft summer. The peak of the holiday season. Crimea. The main vacation dream of the average Soviet citizen. A solid iron curtain hung across the borders, and almost no one traveled abroad for leisure. Perhaps a few high-ranking officials. But even they traveled only on official business. A family trip somewhere outside the Soviet Union was simply out of the question. And Simferopol was the only civilian airport in the region. There were always plenty of military ones nearby, of course. The 7 of us walked to boarding, formally, without a single seat. But that was only on paper. In reality, something would almost always suddenly turn up. A mismatch. A no-show. Some small imperfection in the system that occasionally worked in your favor. This time, we were only partly lucky. 2 seats appeared. They immediately went to my wife and another girl. The rest of us remained standing somewhere between hope and common sense. There was, however, an official workaround. So-called jump seats, service seats used by the flight attendants. Built in with a margin, almost as if they had been designed exactly for situations like this. Besides, our Tu-154B was not entirely standard. Out of 28 aircraft in Boryspil, only 2 were configured this way. No galley. Designed mainly for short routes, Simferopol to Kiev and similar flights. As a result, instead of 2 separate cabins, there was 1 long cabin. 180 passengers instead of the usual 164. Near the rear door, there was a curtain. Officially, it was meant to separate part of the cabin. In reality, it was almost always open. Passengers in the back could see straight through the entire aircraft. Why does that matter? Because every passenger knows that moment when you look out the window and suddenly notice the wing flexing in flight. Let's just say, not everyone finds it reassuring. And here, passengers got an entirely new level of trust in aviation technology. People sitting in the rear could watch the ceiling breathe ever so slightly. Not as visibly as the wing, but enough to give some people unnecessary thoughts. There was no galley, which also meant no jump seats in that area. Everything was concentrated in the forward vestibule. Sashka, 12 years old, and I were assigned to jump seats in the cockpit. But we still had 3 more children with us. Luckily, the flight had no catering service, so the number of flight attendants had been reduced. Still, 1 seat was missing. That left the forward lavatory. In this configuration, it was used mostly as a wardrobe for the flight attendants. Though honestly, everything inside remained exactly what it had always been, both in form and in function. That's where Allah, a future bank manager, was seated, right on the toilet lid. And from a practical point of view, it wasn't even a bad seat. No seatbelt, of course, but the flight was short, and our pilots usually flew smoothly. Gradually, everyone settled in somehow. Some comfortably, some less so. But the important thing was, we were on board. The crew began preparing for departure. Episode 5, we let Sashka land the plane. The weather was perfect for flying, perhaps just a little too hot, around 30 degrees Celsius, but the aircraft was light. After all, the main factor affecting maximum takeoff weight is fuel, not payload. On the Tu-154B, the maximum payload was 18 tons, while maximum fuel capacity reached 39. For our flight to Kyiv, the calculated fuel load was only 13.5 tons, including 6 tons of reserve fuel. According to regulations, In case of unforeseen circumstances, the aircraft still had to land with at least 1 hour of fuel remaining. So despite the heat, the aircraft lifted off easily. We were cleared to climb on course. Directly over our boarding house, not far from it, stood a navigation beacon. I gave Sashka an aviation headset so he could listen to the radio communications. He didn't understand a single word. The Tu-154 was a fast aircraft, comparable even to the fastest modern passenger jets. And about 35 minutes later, we were already descending toward Borispil Airport. Borispil's runway is oriented almost exactly north to south, or south to north, depends on the landing direction, and that, in turn, depends mainly on the wind. When the wind is calm, the controller usually decides based on traffic conditions. We got lucky. We were cleared for what pilots call a straight-in approach. We were arriving from the south, so the aircraft lined up almost directly with the runway, without unnecessary maneuvering. Not only convenient, it also saves around 8 to 10 minutes of flight time. We intercepted the glide path, the invisible line the aircraft follows all the way to touchdown. "Sashka, look, there's the runway," I said. He stood up, looked forward, and immediately ducked back down. "Come on," I laughed. "Take a look. It's beautiful." But Sashka stood up once more, and then hid behind the seat for good. Meanwhile, the command came, "Idle," and we were already racing just above the runway. The navigator, calmly and clearly, was calling out the height from the radio altimeter. 1 meter, 1 meter, 1 meter. We had settled into ground effect. That's one of the peculiar characteristics of the Tu-154. Because of its powerful low-mounted flaps, if the speed is even slightly too high, the aircraft can float half a meter above the runway, refusing to land and risking a long touchdown. But there were spoilers, or interceptors. In simple terms, air brakes. Anyone who has flown on modern airliners has seen them. Panels on the wing that rise up and reduce lift. Normally, they are not supposed to be deployed before touchdown. Though honestly, pilots were not exactly executed for it either. On modern aircraft, they deploy automatically after touchdown once the landing gear compresses. In short, sometimes you choose the lesser evil. The captain reached for the lever, and from almost zero height, the aircraft firmly planted itself onto the runway, within limits, of course. Landing loads are carefully monitored, but the feeling stays with you. Naturally, once we got off the aircraft, the first question came immediately. Why was the landing so hard? There was no point explaining all the nuances of flying a Tu-154 to children right there on the spot. So I simply said, well, we let Sashka land the plane. And somehow, that explanation satisfied everyone perfectly. Epilogue. About 20 years later, we were sitting around a table, family, conversations, old memories. Next to me sat Alla, now fully grown and working as a bank manager, and I was unsuccessfully trying to convince her that a 12-year-old boy could not possibly have been allowed anywhere near the controls during landing, but her argument was ironclad. Then why was the landing so hard? And there was one more detail. Passenger services had been so accommodating that they completely forgot to collect our boarding passes. And later, I was actually able to return them. Yes, with a 20% penalty, because technically it was after the flight. But still, that meant we had made the trip home for only 20% of the ticket price, which leads to an interesting philosophical observation. Sometimes what first looks like a disaster quietly resolves itself in the strangest possible way, and occasionally, even with a profit.